Hello everyone, we are back and it's time to talk about Regulation H, but specifically focusing on strategies. So if you're new to the channel or new to just playing VGC Pokemon, I do hope this does help you out because I am not fairly new to it. I've been playing for, geez, at this point I feel old saying like a couple years now, and that's not really too old compared to the people who are veterans in the scene, but just being able to make content on it to a degree after I started my YouTube channel, this feels cool, and I've been playing. But also Regulation H is just really good for beginners and people who just want to kind of get an experience of Scarlet and Violet without all of the legendaries running the show. This is a great time as it's about to be time for Regulation H. So getting into it, we're talking about sand today. So if you're wondering, what is sand? For those wondering, for weather conditions, you have your multiple weather conditions, but importantly for specifically sand teams, we're focusing on the sandstorm weather condition, which is the only weather left in the game that actually causes damage specifically. So I'll talk about some of the important facets here, which basically when Sandstorm is created by a normal Pokemon or a Pokemon that use Sandstorm as a move, it creates the weather condition for 5 turns. These are some of the additional effects it has. All Pokemon lose 1/16 of their max HP at the end of each turn, except for Ground, Rock, and Steel Pokemon. Then there are also those Pokemon that have caveats through their effects, or basically abilities here, like Magic Guard, Overcoat. Pokemon with Sand Force, Sand Rush, and Sand Veil also don't lose their health. And additionally, for after Generation 4, Sandstorm actually gives a special defense buff to Rock-type Pokemon specifically by increasing their special defense by 50%, which is pretty cool to know. Little extra detail. Some of the additional effects that work in Sand that are related to it specifically, we have Sand Force, which increases the power of Rock, Ground, and Steel-type moves by 30% when used by the user. Sand Rush doubles the speed of the user in the Sandstorm, and Sand Veil increases their evasion by 20%. So those are the main facets and abilities that are pretty good with Sand as a condition. Talking about basically the main ability to access the weather condition. We're talking about Sandstream here. Currently, there are 3 Sandstream specific ability Pokemon, but only 2 are available in Scarlet and Violet at the moment, and obviously for the foreseeable future, because we're probably not getting another DLC, so this is what we got to work with. So our 2 of choice are Hippowdon and Tyranitar. Now you can use both on the same team, you could use them separately, but for the premise of the video, I'm going to keep on referring to probably the best one of this point. That's actually going to be Tyranitar, as I think Tyranitar, when we look at the stats in a second, you'll see why it's the primary Sandstream user, as it's pretty much the best Sandstream user, as it's basically a pseudo legendary or powerhouse Pokemon as they're called. Also, it having Dark and Rock typing basically allows the Sandstorm to give it a 50% boost to its special defense immediately because it's already a Rock type, so that already gives it an advantage. Dark is a good coverage type to allow it to deal with like Psychics and some other Pokemon, so you know it's not actually that bad, and its stat-wise, having a base stat total of 600 is really useful for a Pokemon like this because it just means that it's the strongest, I believe, weather-setting Pokemon that's a non-legendary Pokemon, so it does allow Tyranitar to fill this niche extremely well, and it already makes it just a little bit easier to build around in teams. Scarlet and Violet has been a little bit difficult for Tyranitar, but it's only really because the power creep has been pretty bad this generation. Bad, I mean it's really strong. So a lot of old Pokemon have been pushed down, but Tyranitar always finds its way to sneak in, and during Regulation H, it will be returning because it is arguably really good for this format. Now, looking at some of the Pokemon that are paired up with Tyranitar, we will be looking first at the Sand Rushers because effectively Sand Rush is kind of the only ability that most people talk about when it comes to the sand-based abilities. I do think Sand Veil is a cool ability, but we'll talk about that later on with like picks of other Pokemon. When it comes to Sand Rush, there are 2 Pokemon that are really taking the key here for Sand Rushers, and they're usually on the physical side. That's just because they usually have the highest speed. So Pokemon with Sand Rush with high speed or moderately good speed are always really good, but even when they're offensive a bit, it really does help. So both Lycanroc and Excadrill find their ways here, with Lycanroc actually taking advantage of the Sandstorm to boost its special defense 50% is actually really good because the Pokemon is only at a 487 base stat total, so that does keep it a little bit lower than others. And then Excadrill here comes at a 508 base stat total, but the main advantage to Excadrill versus Lycanroc is that it is a ground steel type with some of the most powerful steel and ground moves at its disposal. with a 135 base attack off the start. It's extremely strong. It's somewhat frail. It's not the best defensively, but this Pokemon isn't necessarily designed to do that. It's supposed to work in the Sandstorm to be extremely aggressive, get those KOs, that damage when you need it, and it gets the job done. Lycanroc, on the other hand, actually has one advantage specifically over Excadrill that does allow it to do some more shenanigans, and the fact that it's a rock type, it has access to Rock Slide, but more importantly than that, it has a 112 base speed, and in the Sandstorm, it is moving extremely quickly. This allows Lycanroc to do a lot of different things and attack very fast, so it does have its somewhat advantage over Excadrill, whereas Excadrill's advantage is that it is a heavy hitter. The problem is, Lycanroc is just a faster, slightly, not as strong, but fast. It still hits hard enough, so you do get to pick between the two of them. And when it comes to building sand teams in Generation 9, for the most part, both of these Pokemon have been considered on both sides. Excadrill, just now returning in the Indigo Disc, really has seen its resurgence back onto the metagame thanks to Tyranitar's existence in the game, but more importantly for Excadrill to return so it can give teams a little bit more of an oomph to these sand teams. Now, we're going to be talking about beneficial types and abilities, which are very important when we need to talk about how Sandstorm functions. So obviously starting off with types, because this is important, we need to talk about the fact that Rock, Steel, and Ground types will be your primary focus on the Sand team. Now, I'm not saying they're going to be the default. Some people only use Sandstorm as a weather condition, while they use a lot of other Pokemon to kind of support the damage from the sand. I've seen that before, but specifically for this video, we're not talking about that. We're talking more about what you can do. And starting off, obviously, Rock, Steel, and Ground are the focus. So Pokemon that have this additional typing are already going to be advantageous for you to build around it when you're building a Sand team. Additionally, Terra is something in the format that you will have to play around with, so Terra types are important here, because if you're able to use Steel, Ground, or Rock as a Terra type, you may want to think about that Pokemon being on your team, because it does allow it some access to basically being under the Sandstorm without taking damage. And if it Terras into a Rock type, remember it will get a 50% boost to its special defense, so that can always be a little clutch, but it is niche. Talking about some of the main cores you can use a Grass, Fire, Water core. Believe it or not, there are very good Pokemon that have these typings, additionally with the Steel, Rock, and Ground typing. So you can use Pokemon based around the Sandstorm by having dual types like that. But you can also just choose to not. Sometimes Pokemon are not necessarily needing to have the defensive typing to take the Sandstorm damage. Something like Rillaboom can offset that with its Grassy Surge ability, getting some health back instead. You could also put Leftovers on a Pokemon if you want in order to gain its health back from the Sandstorm damage to keep that mitigated. And then you have some Pokemon with abilities where they can just be immune. But the point here is these Pokemon are definitely thought of, and you can think to use them on your team, because using the best Pokemon are always good. But thankfully, there's another core you can use. So this is the Fairy Tail core, which is a Steel, Dragon, and Fairy typing designed around the fact that, these Pokemon go in their own type triangle, very much to Grass, Fire, Water. So it's very interesting to see that being the case here, because it does allow you to deal with some of the best threats, especially in Regulation H. There's going to be a lot of different Pokemon that are going to be able to be there, and a lot of different typings. So if you can base your team around different cores, you can kind of cover for a lot of weaknesses. Also, the fact that Fairy isn't necessarily the best typing in Regulation H, based solely on the fact that the best Fairy type Pokemon for the most part were the Paradox and Legendaries. You will see a reduction in their play, but there are still some good Fairy Pokemon you can play with. Also, Steel being a main part of this core already does allow the core to be used a little bit better, I think, on Sand teams, based on the fact that Steel is a component. So whatever Steel Pokemon you choose to pick, or Pokemon with the dual typing of Steel, it already has an advantage that other Pokemon wouldn't be, because Sandstorm will not hurt it. Now, when we are talking about the extra abilities, these are some of the advantageous abilities that we need to look over. First, Magic Guard, which is an ability that protects Pokemon from indirect damage. This does help out, but it may not help out exactly as much as the next ability, but this is sort of the sole purpose of that. Magic Guard really deals with indirect damage, so stuff from weather was another thing, like hail when it existed, as well as Sandstorm, but additionally, you won't take damage from, I think, burns, poison, stuff like that, so status conditions. But pretty much we know in VGC the best the best status conditions usually are burning physical attackers, so even if they don't take damage, they're still kind of crippled. You see something like poison isn't like too prevalent, because it does do damage, but it doesn't do damage as bad as, say, burn does, because burn is just really nuisance to Pokemon that get it. Also, additionally, something like paralysis and sleep are just very better, because by stopping a Pokemon permanently or slowing it down permanently with like paralysis is usually just better, because if you give them a chance to not do anything, it's better than giving them a chance to do something, which is what Burn and Poison do. So just putting it out there for you guys. Additionally, Overcoat is here, and I think Overcoat's the best ability for Pokemon that will be in the Sandstorm, specifically based on the fact that they don't just take damage from the Sandstorm, they're protected by it, but they also don't take effects from powders and spores. So one thing about Sand that I really hate is grass types to an extent, and one of the best grass types that usually can get a lot of Sandstorm Pokemon is Amoonguss, because Amoonguss is just a really good defensive Pokemon, but also the fact that it is a grass poison type, it is able to cover a lot of its weaknesses for its other partners against the Sandstorm by using different grass moves, but also more importantly Spore, because a lot of Pokemon that are in the sand unfortunately are very, very slow. So any Pokemon with Overcoat really can't take advantage of the fact that something like Amoonguss can't really do anything against it, and it allows you to cover for some of your weaknesses with your other Pokemon, because an Overcoat Pokemon that has maybe a favorable type advantage to the Amoonguss or any other Pokemon that wants to disrupt you can just be dealt with. Another Pokemon like Volcarona that's going to be very important on other teams in Regulation H does have like Rage Powder, so they can use Rage Powder all they want, but the Pokemon's immune to it with Overcoat, so that may be another clutch situation. But moving into the next portion, we're going to talk about the other strategies you can use in conjunction with Sandstorm. So specifically, the Sand is really useful as a defensive tool for rock types, but you can also use certain Pokemon underneath the weather conditions to basically enable more damage onto you. As one of the benefits Sandstorm does possess is that by being able to damage the opponent's Pokemon slowly, you're now able to take advantage of your Sandstorm Pokemon by allowing them the ability to do more damage inherently, right? So if they land an attack, the advantage they have is that they're going to be doing just a little bit more damage, theoretically, thanks to the Sandstorm. If an opponent has to use Weather as well to shut off the sand, this is actually really good in a vacuum, because there's not really too many moves tied to the accuracy boost by the Sandstorm. The only Pokemon that are really hurt are the Sand Rushers, in my opinion, so they're the ones that really suffer. Sandveil is a useful ability, but we don't use it as much. But the main reason I'm talking about this for strategies is that one of the first strategies we're going to talk about is something I talked about in my last video, is Psy Spam, or basically Expanding Force with Indeedee. So effectively, this goes really well into Sand for a few reasons. One of the best reasons is that there are only a few of the Expanding Force users left that are not legendaries or restricteds, and of them, one is a steel type already in Metagross, which is already another pseudo legendary you could throw on your team, which doesn't clash with Tyranitar. Another is Armarouge, which I think is actually pretty good if you want to use it on this team for coverage with its fire typing. But additionally, you have Reuniclus, which I mentioned in my last video, which has a massive special attack stat, but also is very slow, but is benefited by the sand because of its Overcoat ability, which gives great coverage to sand teams, as having a psychic type does basically put out a lot of damage, and Reuniclus is one of these special attackers that's actually very useful, because a lot of the Sandstorm Pokemon are going to be beneficial under it, are going to be physical attackers. This is nice to have a special attacker, but these are three of the options you can use. I'm actually very glad to know that Metagross gets access to Expanding Force, because I think that's just really, really useful, because I think Metagross is a Pokemon that can find some success under sand teams, because it just allows itself to kind of be this niche like purposeful damage output machine. So Metagross can really do damage alongside Tyranitar or alongside some of the other Pokemon, but it's really, really good to talk about Expanding Force. Now, next one is Body Press. I think Body Press is almost inherently a good ability under the sand, but this is for a few reasons. The biggest reason is the amount of pool of Pokemon that happen to be dual typing with either Steel, Rock, Ground, are just extremely insane, because that means there's so many of them that can fit underneath the Sandstorm. Very famously, Komao is another Pokemon that gets access to Body Press and Iron Defense, so under the sand with Overcoat, it can just kind of avoid the Sandstorm damage, boost itself up, and give you fighting coverage for your team. But there are so many Pokemon here that get access to this combination of moves. It's just really, really good. Some of the better ones I think are obviously like our pseudo or powerhouse Pokemon in the form of stuff like Goodra, or the Hisuian Gudra. You'll even have like Archaludon, which is a fantastic Pokemon thanks to stamina, but also has Iron Defense itself. So if you really wanted to kind of mess around with it on sand, you can bring Archaludon to these teams and allow it to effectively be a double weather Pokemon, because if you are packing Electro Cannon, your opponent can shift terrain. Guess what? They just turn on your Archaludon. Now your Archaludon can just go nuts and start blasting them away with stuff like Electroshock. So, you know, you do have those options as well. But also for your other body pressers, you have things like Corviknight here, which have access to Tailwind, which is a fantastic Pokemon as well to get, you know, basically set up, but also give you the speed if you need for the rest of your team. And then Bastiodon as well, which I put here as more of an interesting pick because there's just so many different Pokemon that have a dual typing in the sand that are able to use body press and possibly Iron Defense. So it's just a really good combination to think about. Now, moving away from some of these specific type combinations, I have one that's actually a good type specific matchup, like a group core, and that's actually Dondozo and Tatsugiri. Specifically Dondozo carrying the safety goggles. This is here for a specific reason, obviously, so it doesn't take damage in the sand. But the main thing is that this is actually a very good, I think, core for beginning players if you want to get used to it. Tatsugiri and Dondozo is basically turning one Pokemon or two Pokemon into one big boss Pokemon. And I think this is a good strategy if you just kind of want to get used to playing VGC. Dondozo Tatsugiri does take some positioning to understand, like when you're trying it, and you have to worry about like Pokemon with haze that can basically get rid of Tatsugiri and Dondozo. But this Pokemon made it, I think, to second in a really big Regulation H tournament. The biggest reason I'm putting it on the list here for you guys and in this video is to show you that you can try other Pokemon that happen to not have the dual typing for the sand and still do very well. I think Dondozo on a sand team actually doesn't sound too strange based on the fact that you use the sand to chip your opponent's Pokemon down. Dondozo and Tatsugiri come in the final hour of your match and basically just sweep the rest of the team. And if people aren't going to respect this specific core of Tatsugiri and Dondozo and Tatsugiri will run through teams. This is something that has already happened a lot in Generation 9 because this duo is very, very strong. So people are not prepared for it. It will defeat them. So just know this is a very good team you could try, or a specific combination strategy you can try on your team. Moving into like one of the last couple of strategies you can use, we have Last Respect Sandrush Houndstone here. This is another Sandrusher, but I did believe it needed to be in its own slot for a few reasons. Last Respect is very good. I think Houndstone is a pretty decent Pokemon for Regulation H. The biggest reason I did not put it alongside Excadrill and specifically Lycanroc is that if you're going to be running Houndstone, the biggest thing you have to keep as a factor is that Houndstone is really meant to come out last with the sand up and really deliver like the final blows to teams, thanks to its move in Last Respects to take all that additional damage from the loss of its teammates. But that is another thing, is that although I like this move and I like this Pokemon, you do have to be cognizant of it, because say for whatever reason your Tyranitar, or if you use Hippowdon, they get knocked out immediately and your opponent has a way to overturn the weather. It makes this strategy just a little bit less good, and I'm not just saying that to sound kind of dumb, but it makes it less powerful because they will be able to overturn that weather, and if they have something faster, it will take out the Houndstone. So you have to keep that in mind. But other than that, I think this is a feasible strategy. Just give it a shot. I actually really like it. And I think it has credence to be on the list as another strategy you can use inherently with the sand. Finally, we basically have Trick Room here. I have Trick Room here for two reasons. I talked about in my last video about how good Bronzong is, as it's a really slow Pokemon, but it's good for the sand because it is a Psychic type, it has a Steel type, it has access to Body Press, Iron Defense, it has access to Trick Room to enable itself. But the reason Trick Room actually makes its way onto sand teams is that a lot of Pokemon in the sand aren't the fastest Pokemon, and you can take advantage of using something like Trick Room against a lot of different team compositions. Another Pokemon I forgot to mention that will be obviously, it basically warrants its own strategy, but it will be in the next slip. It does extremely well under Trick Room, and is basically one of the main reasons why I think this is a great alternative strategy for the Regulation H space. Now, talking about our unique Pokemon, there are a lot of choices that actually fit very well onto the sand teams, but I wanted to basically focus on a few because I do think these are the best Pokemon you can run during Regulation H, but as well as that, they're the ones that will probably see a lot more play in sand. So going over them, we have basically the one I think is probably the most understandable one here, and that's actually going to be Ursaluna Blood Moon. So Ursaluna Blood Moon is basically extremely powerful. It's a very good special attacker, so this will allow you to kind of enable your sand team a bit more by giving it a little bit more variety in the way it can distribute damage out. But the main thing about Ursaluna Blood Moon on a sand team is that it has access to its very good ability or its mind's eye ability, where it basically allows it to hit through ghost types of normal moves. This is important because a lot of the other Pokemon on the list for this specific sand variations are kind of weakened by the fact that they may have to rely on like body press, for instance, as damaging. I think Ursaluna is one of the few ground types that can really deal with other Pokemon with its own actual type moves, because you can Terra this into normal if you so choose, but it is actually a time where I think you could use Terra Fairy on Ursaluna in the sand, specifically to give you coverage against dragons and other typings, where you can use like Moonblast on this Pokemon. I think it's actually really cool that you can, and basically distribute a lot of damage that way. Another Pokemon I obviously wanted to highlight, which I did talk about a little bit, is Archaladon. I think Archaladon is a fantastic Pokemon for sand specifically, in that it allows the sand team to kind of pivot against other weather conditions. I think one of the biggest weaknesses a lot of the other weather conditions do have is that their Pokemon really do need the rain, or they need the other weather to help. I think Archaladon is one of the few Pokemon, because of the way that it's typed, as well as the move pool it has access to and its signature move, it does allow you to be a bit more flexible with this Pokemon. You can choose to either use the Body Press and Electro Shot set. You could also basically change it up completely to allow it to be more of a support Pokemon, where you want to use like Snarl and stuff to weaken Pokemon down. But Archaladon is really able to take advantage of the sand, because if for whatever reason you're playing against rain teams, which are going to be more common with that weather condition, or Pokemon that just have the rain, you will be able to take advantage of that rain by having Electro Shot on Archaladon. Just letting it fire off those moves can punish your opponent. So Archaladon makes the list for that specific reason of unique Pokemon, but also is a fantastic Pokemon option for the sand. Another one I wanted to talk about specifically is going to be Como. Now, Como is a very useful sand ally, and it was already shown, I think, in the season of, or the last season of Pokemon, where someone brought a Como team to win their, I think it was a regional, maybe in Sacramento, I could be wrong, but they were able to bring the Como team all the way to the finals and win the event with it. It was running specifically, I think it was not soundproof, bulletproof, instead of running specific overcoat. But I think because of Regulation H, you can easily run overcoat, giving yourself your own safety goggles to basically just protect yourself from the spores and powders that you might find yourself against in Regulation H. And Como is a fantastic Pokemon for sand, because additionally it's protected with overcoat. It has a good dragon and fighting typing, which allows it to cover a lot of the weaknesses of the team. Fighting does really well into specifically the rock, ground, steel core, which is obviously the focus of the sandstorm. But because you can bring your own, you can bring a dragon, you now have access to kind of deal with other dragon types. You also have access to a few other moves you can use, but more importantly, you have access to body press, and you have access to iron defense on Como, so it can do everything you need it to be. So also talking about another specific Pokemon I wanted to talk about, and I think this Pokemon is very useful, and it probably will be seen a little bit, is going to be Garchomp. I think Garchomp is a Pokemon has seen its like fall from grace in this generation thanks to power creep. But the main reason Garchomp I think we'll see play in the sand is that it almost takes the place of like Baxcalibur on snow teams, whereas effectively what you want to do with specifically Garchomp is that it has access to Earthquake, it has access to Sand Veil if you want to use Sand Veil, it has access to Rough Skin, which I think is the better ability for against like physical Pokemon that want to attack it. But you know, the main thing you have with Garchomp is it's basically just a big damage button combined with any of your other teammates, whether they might have Levitate in the form of something like a Bronzong, or you have a flying type of some sort to go on the sand teams. You're able to utilize and maximize the damage output Garchomp offers, and it does it extremely well under the sand, because it just basically allows itself to just start hitting it really, really hard and punish other Pokemon. It can be special in terms of using something like Draco Meteor if you so choose to, but you don't have to run it. Also with Scale Shot back, you can turn Garchomp into an extremely fast, aggressive Pokemon, and it doesn't actually take that long to get it set up in the sand. So you do have a lot of like really good pseudo legendary Pokemon you can partner up with Tyranitar to be this like just really good offensive and defensive wall at the same time, where Tyranitar can be a lot more defensive thanks to the sand, while as whatever its partner Pokemon can do could be extremely aggressive and start pressuring the other side. So, you know, there's a few other Pokemon I'd like to put in their slots for different reasons. Hisuian Goodra is one, just because it has extremely high defense for body press. You can't really ignore that Pokemon. There's a few others. You basically have a lot of different body pressers you could choose to use from, or Pokemon that really do well in the sand. There's also some good partner Pokemon that don't really matter about their weather conditions too much. Scizor is an option that I wanted to talk about a little bit, as well as Kleavor, because they both have the typings that can fit underneath the Sandstorm. Kleavor can just do a lot of damage with sharpness, but also has specifically the rock typing, so the boost is there from the Sandstorm. Scizor is here as a very fast Pokemon that can allow itself to kind of work in the sand with like Bullet Punch, and you want to be able to just kind of whittle down your opponent. So Scizor can just come in and effectively Bullet Punch opponents that are already really low in health out of the game. So you can keep that as access. Different fighting type Pokemon that have access to like Mach Punch is another kind of typing you could choose to use. I think one of the advantages of Sand is that it's actually not as limiting. I think in specifically Generation 9, you have a lot more tools at your disposal. I think, although I think Dynamax and Gigantamax is really cool for Sand because it allowed them to use Pokemon that could probably take the sand damage a bit better, but also kind of deal with it easier. One of the advantages I think for Generation 9 is that a lot of Pokemon that are very, very good in the sand or outside of the sand have been made that have the specific abilities and types to go with it, so it just makes the Regulation H format just a little bit more fun and allows you to kind of experiment a lot. But pretty much that's all I've got for you guys when it comes to sand. I don't really think I need to tell you about templates of how you should build your teams. You can really test out yourself. Like on ladder, I played against the sand team that had both Hippowdon and Tyranitar, so they could choose however they wanted to lead. And I wasn't really a Hippowdon believer until I faced it. And yeah, they kind of changed it a little bit for me because I think Hippowdon's actually not as bad as like people will make it out to be. However, one thing I will say is if Hippowdon was a rock type, it would be a lot better of a Pokemon because it would get that 50% boost in the special defense. But that's just me talking about how I think this Pokemon could be insane. Pretty much, these are a lot of options for you guys to choose from. Take it at your own pace. Enjoy the format. And if these videos do specifically a lot better, I will make more Regulation H based videos just for the time being because I am enjoying it. This isn't something that's going to shift from my other normal content. If you are one of my current subscribers that are watching, don't worry, my normal content or the stuff that has already been coming out will be coming out. This is just something I'm doing as a segue because I've been having fun and I wanted to kind of bring that out to everybody else as well, but also get people who have maybe never seen the chance to really take that step forward and play in VGC. But that's all I've got for you guys today. As always, this has been Brad from the Ad Army signing off, and for all of you out there, to sign on.